So let's think about one of the things. If I ask you a couple of questions, I mean, you went to Web Summit last year, Richard, and you're obviously going to this year. What's your general view about how much or what preparation startups should be doing when you're thinking about how they should approach it?
So Web Summit last year was the first time that I'd been. I'm used to going to trade shows like CES and IFA and that kind of thing, with which is all about products. So it's good to meet actually to meet people. I think the most important thing for me is that as a startup, as a kind of an attendee of Web Summit, it's really, really important to be able to tell your story in a very concise way. Simply because, as a journalist, we get a lot of pitches where people use words like platform and solution, and sometimes it's hard to even know what a thing is. Is it an app? Is it a website? Is it a piece of hardware? What is it? So to be able to kind of pitch what you are and how and what you are and what you're doing and why you're interesting is very important. And to be able to kind of explain that in a very concise way, that's probably, I think, the most important preparation. And to be able to kind of illustrate that story as well. So if you have someone who can explain it in a very kind of human way, like what it actually means for people, whether you have photos, whether you have videos, just a way of being able to tell your story. I think that's the most important thing to be prepared about, is to be able to tell your story in a way that, why should people care about this?
Yes, yeah, so it's a sort of a classic elevator pitch scenario, but I suppose the way that startups and entrepreneurs need to think about it is that you're not pitching to an investor, you're not pitching to in that scenario, you're actually pitching what the news is, or what the story is, and that usually is the same thing, but not necessarily. And you have to think really hard about what's the news angle into what you're proposing. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's quite interesting, really. Sometimes I'll talk to startups or even big companies, and they'll say, well, here's our exciting new thing. And I'll sort of look at it and go, well, it's kind of interesting, but I quite like this weird little feature that you haven't really mentioned that I've just noticed. And they'll say, oh, that's not that interesting. And I'll be like, well, that's the novel, interesting thing. So it's having that kind of awareness of what's novel, what's different, what's unique, what's quirky, what's kind of interesting. And it's not necessarily, like you say, it's not always the same thing that's going to get investors excited, but it is maybe the sort of thing that's going to, make for a good headline or get readers interested. Because that's what we are. I mean, that's all we're doing. It's all about saying how to hack the media, like it's this complicated thing. But really, all we're doing is we're just kind of middlemen to kind of tell the story of a startup or a company, and kind of tell that story just to regular people. So just think about like what regular people might be interested in, and I guess that's the secret to hacking the media.
And I think the truth is, obviously, there are. The Web Summit, it's a big event. It's over 3 days. There are 600 speakers. There are, a couple of thousand startups, if not more. There are 1,000, there are going to be more than 1,000 journalists, and everyone's going to be rushing around, and you're going to be rushing around. And the truth is the media that are there are going to be time poor and pressed for time. So you have to be, you have to, if you're going to grab someone's attention, you have to be quite quick on the pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, last year, because it was my first time at Web Summit last year, I kind of spent most of my time at panels and speeches and keynotes and that kind of thing, because I wanted to know what I was doing. And so this year, I kind of having got a feel for the place, this year I want to be able to kind of wander around and maybe chat to more people, and hopefully find the little startup that no one else has covered yet. Kind of these little stories that are just starting out, and kind of being one of the first people to tell those stories, which would be great. But yeah, like you say, time is a real problem. So being able to sum up what you do in a concise way is very interesting. I mean, so it wasn't actually at Web Summit, but last year when I was at Mobile World Congress, the mobile trade show, one of the stories that I got, which I was really pleased about, was they had a sort of startup section off to one side. They had all the big companies pitching their phones and stuff in the main show, but then they had it was almost like a mini Web Summit of startups and small companies off to one side. And I just sort of wandered around and chatted to a few people. And one of the things I noticed was there was a water company that had a couple of drones on their stand. And I thought, I don't know what that's about. That's kind of interesting. So I went and chatted to them. And I ended up getting this story about how this Spanish water company, just a utility company, you know, not particularly well-known tech name or anything, they were using drones to underground in their water system in Barcelona. And so they were able to kind of grab my attention, and I was asking them about it, and I was really interested in it, and they almost didn't know how interesting that was, and it took a little bit of work to kind of coax the story out of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of, like, you know, they had the drone there, and I saw it, and that was kind of what grabbed my attention in the first place. And they were then able to tell me more about it. So that's I think really important, to be able to kind of have something that stands out, so that when someone's just walking past, when I'm just walking past, I'll be able to look and go, oh, that could be interesting. I'll go and have a chat to them.
Yeah. And I think I mean, the truth is that it's a big event. There are lots of headline speakers, and there will be media at Web Summit who are really just going to focus on the speakers and what they're saying on the stage. And there will be media there who are going to focus on, you know, exclusive interviews with, you know, with Ed Catmull from Pixar and so on and so forth. And they'll be preaching at some level. So one of the things I always wonder about is how realistic sometimes people are about the media that they need to target to make the contacts. What do you say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one thing to remember, I guess, is that if you do speak to me or to any journalist or any member of the media, that doesn't necessarily mean that I or that person is going to run away and sit down and write a story about your startup immediately. But it's the start of a conversation, and it could be that you know, when when we leave Web Summit and we look back at our notes and say, okay, well, who were the interesting people we spoke to that we didn't get a chance to cover? We could maybe come back to your startup at a later time. So, you know, be realistic about the fact that it's not necessarily going to lead to loads of coverage if you do get a chance to speak to someone. But yeah, it could be the start of a conversation. It could lead to something else. I mean, it could just as well be, you know, like you say, Web Summit is really, really busy. There's loads of stuff going on, and it could be that one day I speak to a really interesting startup, but I haven't got time to cover them because I've got to run off to a keynote or something. And the next day I might have a bit of spare time, and I'll still talk to a startup, and I get to write about it because, you know, I have that spare time. But it's just about scheduling. So yeah, like you say, be realistic about, you know, that it won't necessarily always lead to something, even if you do put in the preparation, if you do get a chance to sort of pitch to someone. But yeah, it's the start of a conversation. Yeah, it really is.
But it's about, yes, and I suppose, you know, if you're coming from a specific country, then perhaps it's a realistic expectation to think about the journalists that are coming from that country and target them. If you're in the IoT space, then actually, who are the key journalists that write about IoT? Are they coming to Web Summit and targeting them? You know, there'll be general business correspondents who really aren't very aren't deep into the tech. So you know, they'll want the big headline stories or the investor stories and something like that. So they wouldn't necessarily be the right targets for you. I suppose the good news is that Web Summit, with that number of journalists coming, and I would say this wouldn't die, but you know, is that there should be journalists that are the right audience for your story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's the great thing about big events like this, is that so many people come together. That yeah, I mean, from the startup side, there's so many journalists who cover different things, like say at different levels, and then from our point of view, it's great to have so many different startups there and like whole industries gathering together. It's yeah, it's really good for us. Yeah, and like I say, targeting is important. I mean, I have a fairly general remit, so I'm not too bothered about people targeting very specifically me. I quite like to hear from loads of different people, and then I get to choose, you know, who I want to write about. But yeah, being able to target the people who are important in your space is very, very important. And thinking about what different websites need as well is very important, whether it's like an overview or, like you say, something more technical.
And at the event itself, so thinking about obviously each startup has a stand for a day. They're at the event the rest of the time. You know, there's the journalists will be in the media village. It'll be difficult for folk to have access to that media village because the media need to have their space to work in. Sure. So if you're sort of patrolling the floor, what would your advice be for someone coming up to you? They've got their pitch in their head. They may have a card or a press release or something in their hand. How would you suggest that they would approach someone like you and go about that sort of face-to-face thing?
I think the concise pitch is the most important thing. Yeah, to be able to sort of say in one sentence, you know, what it is that you do and why it's interesting and why you should care and why it's different to other players, and you know, especially if it's a startup that's doing something in a space where there's already a big name, whether it's Google or whoever. You know, why you stand a chance, I guess, is one way of looking at it. Yeah, just, you know, being able to say straight away what it is that you do, because, you know, with the best will in the world, I'd love to speak to everybody. I'd love to stand and chat to every single person and find out what they're doing and kind of delve into the story, but it's just too busy. So yeah. So a concise pitch would be really useful. You could buy me a drink, wouldn't hurt either.
Yes, it's always a good plan. And I, you know, as head of comms, what I would also say is that you know, the journalists that are coming are going to be at the dinners and at the drinks and at the parties and so on and so forth at the events, and so that, you know, it isn't just at the event itself. I would say that a lot of the best connections at Web Summit generally, not necessarily media and startups and others, but actually just generally the best connections are made when people have a little bit more time in the evenings and a bit more social occasion. I think it's fair to say, I suppose, and you know, I don't think you're one of them, but I think it's fair to say that there are journalists and there are media who don't necessarily want to be pitched at an event. That's just simply not the way they go about things. And I think it's probably worth saying that, you know, it's you have to play by ear. That I think, you know, they don't want to be, it's no point stalking those folk. You have to politely try and have a conversation, and if it doesn't work, you have to accept that there are some journalists who are just focused on what they want to get on with, and the connections they've already made ahead, the agenda they've already set for themselves. And that's just the way it has to be to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, some journalists, for example, I've heard some journalists talk about how they don't like to be sent unsolicited email pitches, which is, you know, it's just the way people operate. I personally, like I say, I'm quite open in my remit. I quite like hearing lots of different people, but yeah, different people operate in different ways. So yeah, and people might not necessarily always have the time to speak right at that second as well. That's the other thing, because there's so much going on. But you know, like I say, it's the start of a conversation. You know, if you can take a card and swap cards and swap email addresses, or hand over a USB stick with a press release, that's a start of a conversation potentially.
So one thing that we've asked all our startups to, and we're going to do the best we can here at Web Summit to distribute lots of people's press releases.
Yeah.
To as many media as possible. And this year there's a media portal where lots and lots of press releases will be uploaded for media to get at, and so on and so forth. I should say that all the startups have access to what we're calling a startup app, and they can upload their press releases via the startup app. The deadline for that is actually today, so please, if there's anybody listening in, please do that today via the startup app. But what would you say about the keys about writing a press release, about thinking about how to grab a journalist's attention writing a press release? I mean, I used to, and I know you certainly do, get a lot of press releases. What would be your couple of top tips about how to write the best press release?
I think, well, the main thing is being very clear about what it is that you're actually pitching. I mean, like I say, you know, I read a lot of words like solution and platform and that kind of thing, and come away thinking, I don't know if it's an app or a website or what it is, and you have to go back and say, well, what is this? So that's the most important thing, is to be very clear about it and what it is up front. And then I guess beyond that, so once you've got that kind of headline thing in there, to then put as much information as you can. You know, the ideal situation would be if I could just write a story from a press release and maybe ask you one question. You know, if I have to come up with loads of questions and try and work out what something is, then that's not ideal. So yeah, as much sort of information and background information in there as possible, as long as you've got that headline thing at the top as well. And then of course, photos and videos and that kind of thing are also really useful as well.
Do you think, I mean, do you like to get press releases as an attachment, or do they need to be in the body of the email, or how? Because I know that can be a bugbear for some people.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to be honest, I've heard this before. I don't really understand, you know, people kind of, journalists sort of being precious about how they receive email, about how they receive press releases. I mean, if it's loads of photos or something, then probably an FTP link is good, or a Dropbox link or something like that, rather than attachments. If it's just text, then stick it in the body of the email so I can see it easily. The other thing to bear in mind as well, actually, from that point of view, is that, you know, quite often, especially in an event, I might be looking at a press release on my phone. So if it's loads of pictures, I'm not going to be able to see that as easily. But if it's just some clear, concise text saying exactly what it is, then I can, yeah, and where you are in the show as well, actually, is a really, really useful piece of information, how I can get hold of you if it is interesting. So yeah, just as much information as can be put in there as possible. But I'm not that bothered about how it comes, as long as it's not filling up my inbox, and I can see it fairly easily, and I can get back to you and talk to you if I need to. That's the main thing for me. But yeah, but be aware that some people are more strict about how they want to be contacted.
In my agency PR days, the sort of advice that I used to give to in writing press releases is that you've got to obviously get the intro, you've got to get the headline right, and then it's really a question of being very sometimes bullet points, or, you know, try almost, I mean, I wouldn't recommend this for everything, but try and think BuzzFeed in terms of the way they have those attention grabbing headlines. You know, put your contact details in there. Put one quote from the CEO, that the most important person, having one or two quotes, not absolute pages and pages, and the whole thing needs to be not more than a page. So the whole thing needs to be pretty short and sharp. And the thing is that when you're a startup, you want to say everything, because you're so keen to get your story out there. But in the end, you've got to think of the journalist is actually, you know, the piece of copy, the piece of the article, the blog, or the piece is not going to be that long. So if you overwhelm them with too much information, all you're doing is asking the journalist to wade through loads and loads of stuff. So give them the hits, and if they want more, then if you've enticed their interest, then they can come back to you for more stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And we're at CNET, we're very focused on products, on hardware, and the best thing to get when you're being pitched a particular product, whether it's a phone or a camera or anything, is a table of specs. Because I don't want to have to read through, you know, paragraphs and paragraphs and pick out one spec from each paragraph. If I can just get it all in a table, then that's really, really helpful. It doesn't necessarily work for everything. It doesn't necessarily work so well for an Apple software or something. But if you've got a hardware product, then that's really, really useful. It's just good thing to bear in mind, really.
And I think the point about that is, and it's obviously you at CNET, you have a particular view of a way of writing your pieces around product launches and stuff like that. And so, you know, what I suppose the lesson for startups with regard to Web Summit, and actually more generally, is that they need to do their research as to the sort of context in which they're putting their stories. So if is important in specs, then put the specs in. If another company is really important on telling the startup founder's personal story, then put that bit in, but understand the audience and the target that you're aiming for, and deliver to that. I always say, and I think this is very true, that you know, at Web Summit itself, in the hurly-burly, is that the more that you can put yourself in the mind of the journalist that you're trying to get at, then the better you're going to be able to help them, and the more successful you're going to be. And it really is just a question of stepping away from yourself to a certain extent and trying to put yourself in those journalist shoes. Just as you would in a sales, just as you would in a sales pitch, just as you would in any sort of relationship, if you're trying to make it profitable for all concerned.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to remember as well that when you say putting in the mind of the journalist, what that really means is in the mind of the audience. You know, it's like regular people who are reading about it. I'm just a middleman, really, trying to communicate what you do to my readers. So, you know, don't try too hard to sort of write the story for me. You know, we can write the story. We just need the kind of raw materials, and then it's about kind of reaching out to the audience. And someone who's reading CNET is going to be very different to someone who's reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Guardian or whatever, or BuzzFeed. So yeah, just think about like who's actually going to read it, and how, you know, what story you want to tell that person.
Okay. So from your Web Summit experience last year, what were you writing about last year?
Last year I mostly covered the keynotes and the panels and that kind of thing. So it was about sort of the big names that were there. But, you know, we covered stuff like, so drones was a big theme, that kind of thing. We talked a lot about sort of the entertainment business and sort of Sky and Netflix and what they're doing. There was the producer of House of Cards was there, and that was quite interesting hearing his thoughts about the future of the television industry. So those are sort of the big themes. I'll be interested to see what the themes are this year. I imagine drones and the future television will come up as well. But yeah, it'll be interesting to look for what those big themes are. I mean, that's something else for startups to remember as well, is that we might go and watch the big keynote by a big name from a big company, but then you kind of want to know who are the little guys who are coming along to do something interesting in that space. Yeah. So who's possibly driving things forward in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're so at Web Summit here, we're obviously getting thousands of requests from media, and I do actually mean thousands of requests from media to be linked up with speakers, to set up interviews, and they are looking for packages of things, and the startup aspect of what's happening in a particular vertical, or what's happening in IoT, or what's happening in VR. The startups, the validation that those interesting startups can be, and how. So it might be that this, we are pushing people. We have curated lists of startups that we think are really interesting, and we're pushing those out to the media as well. And so, I mean, how many pieces, just generally, I think it might be interesting for people to understand how many articles or pieces or online pieces did you write from last year approximately?
Well, I think my boss expected more, but they always do. I think I wrote maybe 2 or 3 articles every day, depending on how many things I'd seen. And then I came back and I wrote some more following up afterwards. So it is pretty busy. It is quite hard to kind of go and see all these speeches and speak to all these people and then actually crank out the article afterwards. I think I probably wrote 2 or 3 things every day. So yeah, it can be quite intense. But thing to remember is that there's always follow-up stuff afterwards as well. So I went away, and after I came home, I got out my notes and I looked at my USB sticks of press releases and all the business cards I'd collected, and I went back and I wrote a couple more things. So yeah, so it's good to speak to as many people as possible, really.
So I think we're beginning just to run out of time now.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Would you say, so if you're a startup thinking about, like, you're coming to Web Summit for the first time, what would be your key piece of advice and the way to think about journalists and media generally at the event? What would your key thing be?
I think that being able to tell everybody you meet what it is that you do in a very clear, concise way is really, really useful, because you never know who you're going to bump into. And then at the same time, also having an idea of who you want to target, who you want to speak to, who's the kind of an important person, who's an influencer in that kind of area. Try and look out for that person. But if you do speak to them and they don't write anything, or if you don't catch up with them, it's not the end of the world. Because the other great thing about having so many people in this small space is that you never know who you're going to bump into. You never know who you're going to talk to. You never know where that story is going to come from. I never know where the really big story is going to come from. And it's a great opportunity for us to come and meet loads of interesting people. It's a great opportunity for startups to meet loads of interesting journalists, and have an idea of who you want to speak to, but at the same time, be really open to speak to anybody.
I think that's fantastic advice.